7 meters from nose to tail, so 4 meters longer than a fully grown modern day Komodo dragon. And of course it also had ferocious teeth, and like its Komodo dragon descendants, it had venom. Of course, this lizard actually developed venom to take down megafauna, giant animals. Of course, they were one of Australia's top predators for thousands, if not millions of years. But unfortunately, when the Aboriginal people came to Australia, of course the giant lizards disappeared because they probably competed with the Aboriginals for food, and they probably even hunted the Aboriginal people, and they were probably killed out of fear because, I mean, look at this, that is enormous, and that is frightening, even to me. But yeah, when humans arrived on the islands, on the island of Australia, many of the giant animals that lived there disappeared, but I'll get to that bit later. But these lizards may be gone, but their descendants, the Komodo dragons and the monitor lizards, live on. This was their range in Australia. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is another one of Australia's top prehistoric predators. It is the thylacoleo, which was a marsupial lion. A marsupial is a mammal that grows its young in a pouch on the mother's stomach. And this was like a marsupial lion, and it had a very well developed thumb claw. So, because while it only grew to about 2 meters long and was probably only about up to a man's thigh, they would probably have been able to tackle a fully grown man. This animal was a great climber. In fact, it's actually believed that the thylacoleo would climb up into a tree and just, when prey wandered underneath, like a kangaroo, a wombat, or anything like that, it would just leap down and ambush them. And it had ferocious looking teeth. And of course, no one's quite sure if this animal lived in prides or lived alone. You know, I'm not entirely sure, but one thing I do know about this animal, well, a few things I do know, is that it was a great climber and that it died out, I think, just a few thousand years before the Aboriginals arrived on Australia, probably due to climate change, because as Australia is well known for being a very, very hot country, so it probably got too hot for this animal to cope. Of course, this was much of their range. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is another apex predator from Australia that only died out just 90 years ago. It was the thylacine, or Tasmanian wolf. This animal was a marsupial, so it was a marsupial wolf, so it grew its young in a pouch on its mother's belly, and this was one of the continent's top predators, and it survived in Australia for millennia. Of course, it lived alongside the Aboriginals, but unfortunately, just about 200 years ago, European settlers arrived in Australia with livestock, guns, dogs, cats, foxes, badgers, weasels and rats, and they decimated much of Australia's unique wildlife, and the Tasmanian wolf was systematically hunted to extinction by humans. In fact, the last known animal here died in a zoo in Tasmania in 1936, and that marked a new low in our relationship with the natural world. And this magnificent animal has not been seen ever since. There are talks about bringing them back, but I really don't think that would be possible, even with today's modern technology. Of course, this was the range of the Tasmanian wolf. They were even found in Papua New Guinea and parts of Indonesia. Now, where I'm going to go to next is the Ice Ages. And yes, there was more than one Ice Age, and I'm not talking about the movies. I'm actually talking about the period where the Earth got colder and colder. And that was all down to a change in the Earth's orbit that took it further and further from the Sun, and that brought on the Ice Ages. First animals I'm going to show you from the Ice Age are probably the most famous of all. They are the mammoths. To be precise, the woolly mammoth and the Columbian mammoth. Now, mammoths evolved from elephants in Africa. In fact, there were two kinds of these creatures in the Ice Ages. There was the mastodons and the mammoths. And woolly mammoths are spread across much of the northern hemisphere. In fact, one place where many of their fossils have been found is around the North Sea and the peninsula that separates Alaska from Russia, because during the Ice Age there was so much water frozen at the poles, it caused a great drop in sea level. So the North Sea and the ocean that separated Russia from Alaska were actually massive grasslands. And of course, the Columbian mammoth was the largest of the mammoths. It grew to be just over 3 meters tall, and it probably weighed about 10 tons. And it had enormous tusks. But like its modern day elephant cousins, mammoths were herbivores, and they mostly would have fed on grass and leaves and twigs. And of course, it's actually believed that, like modern day elephants, much of the plant vegetation would pass through the stomach virtually unchanged. So, because they can't digest plant wall cellulose, cows can do it, elephants can't, and that's why they have to feed for about 16 hours a day. And it's actually believed that mammoths and mastodons were a lot like elephants, that they shared the same social history and family structure. So it's more than likely that large herds of mammoths would have been made up of adult females and their young, because in elephant society, male elephants tend to leave their herd at adolescence, and they either spend their lives alone or they form loose bachelor herds. And of course, no one's actually quite sure how the mammoth went extinct. I mean, a lot of debate over the years has been that it could have been at the end of the Ice Age, about 10,000 years ago, when the ice sheets retreated northwards and their habitat disappeared, or it could have been overhunting by early humans, because we have got proof that early humans like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens hunted mammoths for food, for their fur, for their bones and their tusks. But I mean, it could have been a combination of both of those factors that drove these animals to extinction. Of course, to me, that is absolutely heartbreaking, because we didn't even give the mammoths time to adapt to the changing climates, and because we didn't know any better, and we just overhunted them, which breaks my heart to this day. Of course, this is the range of the Columbian and woolly mammoths. Now I'm going to show you another species of mammoth. This one is very different. It's called the pygmy mammoths. Now, these are mammoths that were actually discovered in the 1990s off on the Channel Islands off the coast of California. And it's Well, that's certainly that these were Columbian mammoths, but they somehow got to the islands, and when the sea levels rose, they were cut off from the rest of the world, and because the islands they lived on, there wasn't enough food to sustain a giant, so they adapted, and these mammoths shrunk from about 10 or 8 tons to about 3 tons over the millennia. So they basically evolved to become pocket-sized versions of their mainland relatives. And of course it's still not entirely clear how the pygmy mammoths have died out. I mean, it could have been in like with their mainland relatives, it could have been a combination of climate change and overhunting by humans coming to the islands, but the truth is we might never know. As you can see here, that was just how tall they grew, just under 2 meters, so they probably grew to be no bigger than a pony. Of course, these are the Channel Islands off the coast of California where they were discovered. And of course, here is the different mammoth species of the mammoths and mastodons. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is one of the most fierce predators of the Ice Age. It is the cave lion. Cave lions were found in Europe during the Ice Ages, and they were very big. They probably grew to be about as big as a tiger, so probably just more than 3 meters, and they had fierce teeth. Their canine teeth probably grew to be about as long as my thumb, and they had greyish-white fur to blend in with the background, and of course they probably lived in caves, hence their name. And of course, cave lions would have hunted things like reindeer, bison, saiga antelope, and probably young mammoths, and they might have even hunted early humans, but of course I'm not quite sure if they did do that, of course. They died out around about the end of the Ice Age, where it was quite possibly a combination of their habitat disappearing, prey becoming too scarce, but also competition with humans for caves, and quite possibly hunted for their fur. Although, to be honest, I am quite glad they're not around anymore, because this is probably the Ice Age animal I would not want to go up against. As this was their range, they were found across much of the northern hemisphere. And the other animal I'm going to show you from the Ice Age is another of the most famous members of the Ice Ages. It is the woolly rhino, also known as the Elasmotherium. This was enormous. It was twice the size of a modern rhino. It could grow to be about probably 6 or 8 tons. And of course, as you can see, it had an enormous horn. In fact, the front horn was about just under 2 meters, so as long as I am tall. And like its modern cousins, it probably had very poor eyesight, but a very good sense of smell and hearing, and they probably would have charged at anything that surprised them, and he'd probably have no hesitation about charging and pounding me with that, and that would really not be a good day for me. And of course, the woolly rhino lived like the mammoths throughout the northern hemisphere, and of course they were specialised for the terrain like the snow and frosted grasslands, which grew different kinds of grass that they could feed on. Of course, no one's actually quite sure why the woolly rhino disappeared. I mean, it might have been when the climate became warmer and its habitat disappeared, that they just couldn't survive in in the changing habitat.